Today's session of the Post-Trial Study Group, or PTSG, in the case against Letitia Stauch, is hosted by Crime Curious and sponsored by the Law Offices of Clifton Black and Excalibur Private Investigation.
Like, I have a hard time even believing. Like, some days I just hanging out in this one space until things clear up in my head. Some days I'm in a bad depression and despair because I've never ever the one thing I pride myself on. I was consistent in my life on a lot of areas. I'd be in and out doing crazy stuff all over the place, very impulsive, manic, doing this, doing that, but I've never, ever I might have not showed up somewhere, but I'd be on a plane somewhere, but like nothing that would anyone ever changed. You're like, but there, and that's hardly, you could ask anyone. Talk kids, had them across the country, this place to that place. Like, sometimes I would just be manic and get everybody on a plane and end up somewhere. Whatever. But the thought of like, put it all together and just looking at evidence, and then you look at evidence and you're like, that's
when we spoke to you last time, you had mentioned and you thought it was an intruder escape, and that you and Lena had moved the body before you even realized.
right. Yeah, that's what I was saying. We got to go to the hospital, but like I didn't know it was until we got to. We have to go out the house, up the stairs, or whatever. Like I never even knew what was going on until we got to the house, and I heard that noise.
Yeah. And I guess my question is, why, even where the body was, why move it?
That was the question I can answer for you. That would have been something that would have been like an instinct from another part of my body to do, because it definitely wasn't to hide or conceal or do any harm in any other way. 100% probably more than likely that would have been like Maria's interpretation. Like, I mean, looking back and forth. In Maria's mind, if it's the person who is child molested, then they need to be eliminated. To be honest, I know you guys have a hard job, but there's not a person here who can stand speed. That's just natural. Rape. There was definitely a lot of the in and out and definitely switching back and forth. Because I didn't even realize. Not even the thought of being an intruder. It was more so the thought of someone in a cave. I told you the cave was red flag. To me, if I had been having thoughts of me and my stepdad throughout that whole time prior there, it's not even dead. And I'm constant with that, off and on my entire life. Like, him being there, him being in a certain situation, or me being back in that house that I grew up in, or in the night terrors of all the abuse that we had lived through. So that's why it would be. If he's come now and I'm dealing with all this with Gannon, mentally, which probably 100% his stepfather is messing with him, like how could it be? This is how protection instincts work. Right? If you were to give me a test on protective instincts, I'm scored 90%, because that's how often framework. And you gotta think I got Bobby upstairs, Dean upstairs. So, and how Maria works is it's not always to eliminate people, like take them out. It could be just to remove people from the situation with everybody. And she has extreme power to that, you know, to actually carry somebody and to do those things. Like when I'm in the Maria mode, like I have extreme power. Unbelievable. Special powers, I guess you could say. And like that. People come back and tell me, oh, it happened since I was young. We support so when I was young. Perspective. Maria and power is to eliminate a threat.
You know Maria pretty well.
I can like an audible conversation, but I can't go through it. But I can have an audible conversation. Or over time, I've been able to. Incidents started happening. My grandpa used to always say, "Something's wrong with that young man." You know, things country stuff. Something's always wrong with that young man. She's always hanging out with all these people. And my grandma would be like, "Oh, it's just imaginary friends." Like, no, it was beyond imaginary friends. Like, I would try to bring my grandpa to people. You know, like, everybody always thought I was just different. Had I hit my head. You know. As it kept going on, situations kept happening, or like, I'd end up in a situation and, like, dead straight would not even know what it was. I went to a doctor in Florida about it one time, but I think they tried to give you all the information, but Dr. Bushman had deleted his feeds every 5 years or something like that. I tried to sign that form for you guys 2 years ago, but I guess now the 5-year mark or something that they don't have it. But like, I'd end up in places like that in Florida, and that's how I ended up at his office. And he it happened so much that finally I became to know who it was around 7 years. I was not visual for Maria, but I can see Taylor, I can see Victoria, but I can't just say it has to be an extreme emotional perspective. If you wanted to see her and talk to her, you'd have to put me in.
Did you say you can have a conversation with her, meaning you can ask for something and she...
Yeah, because like the people that come and see me, they've been coming often. They've been trying to figure out if I can find out why I have so much traumatic stress about growth. And I can figure out why I feel the way I do about how conversation, because they wanted to feel why I felt the way I do about drugs. Because through a lot of those methods, they could talk to Maria. I was younger, my stepdad used to take me to Randy Ray's house, which was his nephew. And during Randy Ray, they always said he was just something was wrong with him, but he did bad drugs or whatever. That's when she triggered things in my memory that I came back to myself and remember taking Randy Ray and my stepdad at a very young age to go get the drive in the car. I just big shit. So that's why I am the way I am. That plus, you know, like I'm pretty sure my mom has perfectionism or whatever. I don't know what it was. You always wanted to do it. So,
So, sorry, going back to what I was asking before. No, it's okay. You said you have an audible conversation with Maria. You also said that there are people coming to see you, I assume doing some sort of therapy with you.
Yeah.
Associated with this, and that's how you talk to Maria?
No, it's been like, it's been a couple weeks that we've been doing this, but they wanted to know why I felt that way about drugs. So, you know, when someone kind of gives you a certain small thing, like you start having those intrusive memories. Like you could not remember something, but then see something that like triggered that memory. And so as I was doing that, it triggered that memory, and that's how I could hear Maria and have the conversation with her about it. So it was part of those methods that we were doing. Find out.
And who's doing these methods with you now?
Whoever might offer.
I don't remember. All right. Well, I'm wondering, probably if they even have an audible conversation with Maria. And the question now, if you can ask Maria, you know, what she was thinking and what she was.
Eventually, if you bring it up like traumatic stuff, I can dig myself into harmony, which in depth what any kind of abuse looks like. It's very hard because that's the only way you get it like extreme. So like, well, the round looks like what it feels like. And I've had to do that once for this process, and it's very difficult because, you know, for the other person having to hear it, you know, I go back and read their, you know, the report of what they typed about what I said with harmony, and it's very disturbing. So yeah, so it.
I definitely don't want to take you back to your childhood. I'm just wondering about, you know, at the time, the alleged defense.
Future
where, you know, for you, the memory gets fuzzy, right, between, you know, you're looking for getting, you're thinking someone's in the house, you see the shadow, you're having kind of that repeated thought of, please see out these 33, time to kill, time to heal. Mm-hmm. And then the next thing you sort of remember is being in the car. And on some level, it sounds like your perspective is an assumption Maria took over at that point in time. And that Maria is your protector. She comes up in these situations where there's a threat. So I'm wondering, you know.
Can you talk to Maria through me is what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay. If you just said it that way,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You said it a lot clearer than I did.
Yeah. How we got into work before was I had to just kind of put my mindset, like, I'm conditioned to hang out like that. So, like, I have to take my mind to hang out in those, reliving it, you know what I mean? And then that's how I can do it.
Okay. I guess I'm wondering why Maria might have moved the body.
I don't think you guys have any other stuff, because like how we did it before was we had like the evidence she's been on. That's how I don't have any of that. That's how we did it before. Would have to have something for me to switch or trigger me, like going into that thought process, or to it's not really daydreaming, it's like just would have to have something in order to do that in order to hear. Can't just be like, it'll be fine. Yeah.
Have any other questions about?
I'm still a little unclear about these gaps. When you can't remember, is that when?
Usually when I can't remember or when there's a blur around me, like let's say I would be in one of those states right now. You guys could be in here and I never even know you're in here. Things around me would not be the same. You know what I mean? So during any time, so okay, let me explain to you from how it started. So when I would get abused, sexually abused by my stepdad, I started noticing like Leticia always got abused. But then I didn't want Leticia. So if I went, I trained my brain to go somewhere else and would harm me to get abused. So that way, if anyone, like when the counselors and stuff like that at school would ask, you know, like me, Leticia, have you been abused? I always kind of like, no, because harm is the person that would be abused. So, back to what you were asking, that's why those gaps come into play, because I can take myself to those worlds. Like, when one of the worlds is Christina, and how Christina works is when I was younger, my mom used to leave me by myself, take care of the kids, and she would try to leave my stepdad with me. But then she'd leave us by herself with a slave, and I would be taking care of kids while she was on his house. So that's how Christina came along, and she's a gymnast. So like, if I have a gap or I go somewhere, I go to, when I was a child, I go to Christina because that was during the time of the Olympics, the 1996 Olympic Games. Everything in my house became like a gymnasium and apparatus. So everything around me was like that. Not like crazy stuff where people be like, oh, there's an alien. It's just that the surroundings are like that, where either like my body gets put in the surroundings. And that's how I had, so that's why whenever there's a gap in it, I went to this place and then something else. Or I make a mess of things if I deal with the trauma. Really. Nothing straight. If I didn't do that, I couldn't have been a teacher. I couldn't have got my degree. I couldn't have done a lot of things because of how I had to deal with so much of it. And it goes on into my adulthood. It doesn't just stop at my childhood, you know. They're there because I'm conditioned to go out there. Something else might be going on in that world. It's not like I just am driving on the road and I'm like, oh, I'm over here. Let me just look. That would be dangerous. It's not like that. If something happens that causes me not to want to deal with it, then I can switch. But the thing about Maria is I cannot just switch to her personality. It has to be in the form of protection, or it has to be in the form of like getting me out of it. So like the other day at the jail, I say the other day, I don't know. I ended up in a turtle suit. I didn't know how I ended up in a turtle suit, right? And so I'm trying to let you see how that gap works. I remember being on the phone, getting ready to dial a number, and I heard them say, hey, you have to move to cell 9 because they're having some construction going on at the jail, right? So they took us out of our ward, and so I won't go to the tower, so I have to that house of segregation until the ward is finished. You know? So I remember hearing them say cell 9. Well, cell 9 is where I developed Janelle because so much trauma in segregation. That's where I developed Janelle. Well, that was the last thing I remember. Then next thing I know, I ended up at SB. And SB was because I was an internal student, and they said I was trying to hurt myself. So I kind of put it all together. I'm like, why was I trying to hurt myself? But what happened was the trigger from cell 9 brought back the memory of the fact that I was going to have to be able to survive in segregation right now, meaning, no book, no radio, no food, nothing, starving, all that, because there's no instruction. That apparently I called my friend Amy, Maria. I called my friend and she was talking in another language. And during that time, they said that I went upstairs at my body, Maria, and the deputy gave me a play-by-play. Deputy Lee said that because she was watching from another camera. She said that Maria looks this way, looks that way, and then tries to jump off. So you know how the jail, they have the rails, and there's like rails like this, tries to jump through the rails. But once I was able to come later on, like piece everything back together, Maria had called my friend, she was talking another language, and then she tried to rescue me. How she tried to rescue me was, she wasn't trying to kill me. She was trying to, like, bungee jump off. Because in her mind, I was like, bungee jumping off. But I am the one that ended up in the truck. So then I had to go through the whole protocol of, why are you going to hurt yourself? So the deputy, when she came, Deputy Browder came to SD, is when I came back through. She said I was talking to her first as Maria, but then she was like, when I came back to myself as Leticia, she said, you were just Maria. And then I was like, why did I turn to? But then once I got everything back together, you could be together. So answering the question, what you just said, that's how it works. So the only way I'm left to piece stuff back together is like the evidence stuff, or like, okay, well, this has got to be clearly you on the camera, and I see myself. Okay, yeah, that's clearly me on the camera. Looking at it, like, that's me. I don't know that's fair, That's kind of how, I don't know if I hope you understand what I'm saying about the gaps, but it's not like I'm just like, hey, I don't remember. It's, I'm not there.
So, like when you find yourself in Orlando,
Mm-hmm.
who gets you there?
Well, I found out through this, is that fire? Oh my God.
I will bet you large money that it's a drill.
Mm-hmm.
As one friend of mine used to say, I'll bet all of your money and some of mine.
Okay.
Where was I? Okay, yeah, so you find yourself in Orlando. At the end there.
All right. Try not to focus on it.
That's distracting.
Well, no, I'm telling you, it's just like crazy because I'm like, I told you how to throw about fire. So what I learned from this investigation is that like they found different things where that she met me before and I was altered. Someone else met me and I was tired. So there are personalities that I'm aware of. Like one of the reports, they were asking about like the FBI talking to some girl and she always knew you at Albany. I'm like, I don't know anything about that. So I think that must be one of the person that wasn't Taylor. That's not me, the teaching it, so it just has to be one of the ones I either don't know about or here I just stayed out for minutes and hours because obviously a plane ride from Colorado to Orlando 3 to 4 hours. So you gotta imagine what it's like. I did this before and ended up in Jamaica, and my daughter been like, "Why are you in the middle of the ocean?" Right? You know. I also think that sometimes that's part of like one of my personalities, which is me, is very polar. So I think you gotta factor in the manic part too, when I just am so impulsive that who cares what's going on around me, you know. So I've been asking myself this question for years. In places like schoolwork, and not even know that I did schoolwork. Like, wow, I submitted. Oh, I thought I didn't do my homework, and I didn't do it. Guess that came in handy for the fact that I didn't struggle with degrees, but I also don't remember a lot about doing some of it because there was so much of that going on, and I was living in Chance side. That was the town I was thinking. That's just not been very traumatic time.
So it was other personalities doing some of the work
Right.
for your degree.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
But presumably when they would turn things in, it made your name.
Right, but they know about me. You see what I'm saying? That's always been a thing. Like, I tell the people in jail sometimes, like, me, they can call me what they want. But then when I'm Taylor, sometimes the deputies, like, will come by and be like, saying my name, and I'm just like, hey, that's Letitia's name. Taylor's name, you know what I mean? So it's just hard to, like, help people with it. Or someone else who's on the outside looking in, they always thought I just hit some teach all around. Well, I fight too much, or, you know, questions.
How would these other individuals get on a plane without ID?
And control of my body. So now they do know that I did have an ID and everything that was Maria Sanchez. But they do know that. So yes, the times that I crossed the border, which work with people in Border Patrol, times I've crossed the border have been as Maria Sanchez. How we ended up in Canada and the whole situation. So they were working on the Border Patrol for that. But that's why, like, on some of the questions, when I answer and I'd say, like 5 or 6, 4 or 5 or 6, because, like, that's when this would happen. It's not like all the time. It's only when certain things have to trigger it. You know? It's not like every day I just wake up and, oh, I don't know what happened. Like, I don't have cognitive. I don't think I do. Because memory as far as, like, you do their little memory things. Of course I'm great at them, but you catch me in the middle of a situation, I may not even be able to tell you the date. So it's still the same for me. When I was talking to the people that come and see me, like, at the jail, like I said, I hit my hand, but I didn't feel it hitting my hand. It hit my hand in Maria. So when they come back and show me all the pictures of how my hand looked, and this girl had drugs or whatever, and she had like this, and she was in debt stuff or whatever. Last thing I remember is I tried to get the deputy's help, and then when he hit me. So when I switched to Maria, that was a perfect example. I didn't remember anything after that because her instinct is protective mode. So when I hit the wall, it's Maria, and then hurts. So by the time I came back to myself, they're all like, "You need something for your hand." Hurt my hand. But I do. The reason the whole thing happened with the shit was because when I was little, I wanted a dog, and some of the dogs were dirty. We're not allowed to have dogs. So they used to make me sleep outside, like first. She was like, "Here, dogs put shit everywhere. Dogs are gross, you know." So another example of why I'm clear with something, because a situation like that, I'm not going to be the one getting shit thrown me. You know what I mean? I'm not going to be the one solving the problem.
You said Maria was speaking another language, Spanish.
Maria can speak Spanish, but my friend said when Maria called her today, she was talking Russian. Because I guess my friend had to figure out what was going on, whatever.
Maria was speaking Russian.
That's what she said. Her name was Amy. Amy said that when I called her as Rita, that she didn't understand at first what was going on. She heard the Spanish, but then she heard the Russian. She's like, wow, this person speaks Russian better than my own friends, what she told me later on. She didn't know that I and my brain do have a Russian.
You speak Spanish?
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing.
I don't know anything about Putin in Russian.
So where would Maria have learned these languages?
I don't know. I mean, I'm one of those, like I told you guys last time you asked me about what did I call it, like when I'm like, all these missions that I'm on, it's probably doing something, but it's missions that when things like that happen, like don't get me wrong now, when I'm in Mania, Leticia didn't make me. I get excited about everything and I want to try everything new. I'm do this, I'm do that, I'm going to fly planes, I'm do that. Like, yeah, but I'm never Russian. So I don't. And they basic, like, hello, you, but not. What did you say the phone call was? So, all this stuff has been going on, and I've been in the hole, but I'm not, like, in trouble. So it would have been somewhere.
In the first month that we talked to you.
Oh, yeah, because that, I had to be in that ward for 13 months, okay? And I had to survive a lot of traumatic things. Not to mention, during the time being in this ward, since being back in there, 2 people have died. So you add all that in, there's a reason why Maria would show up. My person does the radar children. The person behind her name, because a lot of people we've seen have died at the jail lately. Reasons it was triggered it. I can't say, like, I have nothing to do. It doesn't have nothing to do. It gives me time to think. And that's time to think. It brings up church memories. I start avoiding family. I had paranoia. I'm looking behind and looking under this. When those things are happening, you know about to go into protection. Mention the thing happening to flip it up. And like as Leticia, I have a jaw problem. You know,
I'm sorry, guys.
like TMJ.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but like they give me like a certain diet and stuff for me when I'm at the jail because I have TMJ on the jaw. But like if I'm Taylor, I could eat whatever and it don't hurt my jaw. Craziest thing, and people are always like looking at me like that's how they kind of can know the difference, you know.
Yeah.
How I experience.
Before I forget. One item here for one. Yeah.
Oh, that's why I didn't do it because I was confused by that. Because if you have dreams that you don't remember, then how do you know you had dreams? You know what I mean? Like everybody has dreams.
Okay, so you're just not sure how to answer that.
Right. And like it says having dreams that you don't remember the next day. Okay. How would I know if I don't?
Yeah.
Unless I'm reading that wrong. That's just how I.
No, that doesn't make sense.
That's an interesting question. I mean, it kind of goes along with some of the problems. I think you have personalities that you don't know about, how do they know about you?
Mm-hmm. Well, that was what I was telling you about when I saw the stuff with like the Aubrey and the Kylie. Like, I don't know. I didn't know they existed. You know what I mean? Like it had like, and the crazy thing was like full, like when they would show me the stuff, it'd be like full blown email account, full blown like whatever. Like, and then there was one of our personalities is Jasmine, and they had this whole thing where Jasmine went to Dubai. I'm like, oh my goodness, booking tickets to Dubai. So like, you gotta imagine what it's like too when you go to like a job, like say a job interview or whatever, and then like another personality intervening while I was filling out an application. Someone asked me about something, and I'm like just looking at them like, oh. And the reason I bring that up is I had saw that in one of the evidence pieces too. It's like, oh, you don't know what you think about that.
We stopped it at 149.07, Your Honor. Dr. Torres, we take the
Dr.
stand.
Torres, if you would resume your seat in the stand, I remind you, ma'am, that you're still under oath.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I kind of want to pick up where you stopped there. There was a piece of paper that was slung over or under the glass to the defendant. Do you know what that paper was?
Yes, I believe that was one of the papers associated with one of the tests that we had given her that morning, the multidimensional inventory of dissociation.
And apparently she didn't fill out some of the questions with regards to dreams. Is that what was?
It looks like there was one question that she didn't fill out.
Okay. She talked about Dubai and going to Dubai. Do you recall just hearing that?
Yes.
Did you see any evidence whatsoever in this case that the defendant was in Dubai?
No.
When she alludes to talking to Amy in Russian, you recall that conversation?
Yes.
She said that was a jail phone call.
Yes.
Did you have recorded jail calls from the defendant to various people in this case?
We did, but I think that they were closer in time to her to her arrest. If she was saying that they had occurred within that past month, I don't think we had any access to those.
Okay. Did you ever see any phone calls where the defendant was speaking Russian to anyone on a phone?
No.
Did you see any phone calls where the defendant was speaking Spanish to anyone on the jail phones?
No.
Some kind of alarm went off during the interview. What was that all about?
It was a fire alarm. They do them at the hospital every so often, and usually it's a drill.
Okay. And so when that goes off, the defendant seemed to be worried about that.
Yes.
Did you see any change in her personality, any triggering event where she turned into someone else at that time?
No.
Did you at any time during either this interview process or the interviews in March?
No.
You asked her a couple times if she could talk to Maria. Is that what you were asking?
Yes.
Did you ever ask to talk to Maria yourself?
I think we were addressing that with her in terms of whether or not we could have access to Maria to ask her some questions. And as we saw, she explained that it doesn't exactly work that way, but she did say that she could have some sort of audible conversation with Maria, which is what, again, we were trying to ask if that could be possible. But then she seemed to suggest that the only way to do that was if she herself was under some sort of emotional distress or triggered in some manner. She talked about bringing out some of the discovery to put her in that particular mindset. But we were not prepared to do anything like that with her.
Now, is yours and Dr. Gray's insanity evaluation the first insanity evaluation that took place with the defendant?
Yes.
You're familiar with Dr. Lewis's insanity evaluation, that the interview was in November. The report came fairly close to trial, before the trial started.
Yes.
When she says how we got it to work before, when she turned into Maria, was there any context given about that?
It's unclear. I know we asked her if she had been, well, she had said that she was seeing someone at least for a couple of weeks. We had asked if that was some sort of therapy or treatment that she had been undergoing. She seemed to imply that it was, but it was never clear to us exactly what sort of meetings she was having as it relates to that, as she told us that she was informed not to talk about it, so we left it alone.
Would that be a reasonable triggering event for someone who suffers from a dissociative identity disorder, showing them a photograph, for instance, out of discovery?
I honestly don't know.
Okay. Dr. Gray was asking questions about whether or not when she was in school, other personalities help her get through school. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
And Dr. Gray asked whose name was on your assignments or words to that effect. You recall that?
Yes.
Why was that question asked? Do you know?
Essentially, he asked that question because if Ms. Stauch did undergo schooling under one of her other personalities, you would think that that personality would be more in control than Ms. Stauch and would be filling out assignments using that personality's name as opposed to Ms. Stauch's name.
And you recall her telling you that she had identification with regards to Maria Sanchez and that name?
Yes.
And she would use it to go across the border in Mexico and get back that way?
I think she had said Canada.
Okay. We'll talk about Canada as well. Did you ever see any identification with the name Maria Sanchez related to this defendant?
No.
Did you ask the defense to provide everything that you would need to make your determination with regards to insanity?
Yes.
Was that ever provided to you or Dr. Gray?
No.
Speaking of Canada, I'm not going to play this segment, or maybe I will, but let me ask you first. Do you remember her talking about it? And she talked a little bit about it in this last segment about having issues at the border and family members had to help her get back from Canada, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Did you recall her telling you that she had a conversation with one of the Border Patrol agents about golf and Myrtle Beach and that kind of thing?
I vaguely remember that.
Do you recall her telling you that you could look at her passport and see that she's been to Canada?
No, I don't remember
Okay.
saying that.
Did you know that her passport's in evidence?
I think I do remember that.
You know that there's no stamp for Canada.
I don't remember specifically the details of the passport at this point in time.
I'm not going to ask you anything else about the passport then. Did you ask the defense to provide to you all the documentation of her prior medical visits?
Yes.
What did you get?
From defense, I'm going to look at my report as it's listed here.
Sure.
From defense, we were provided with records from Naval Health Clinic from Charleston, North Carolina, Evans Army Community Hospital from Fort Carson, Colorado, and Fort Greely Army Medical Clinic from Greeley, Alaska. And these records detailed general medical and mental health treatment that was received from February 2016 through February 2020. We also got a letter that said it was accepting Ms. Stauch into intensive treatment at House of Freedom from Kissimmee, Florida, but it was undated. We received Doctor's Care Carolina Forest records from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and this just documented one medical visit. So it wasn't anything related to mental health treatment. We got records from Grand Strand Regional Medical Center from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And these detailed, again, general medical visits. There wasn't anything associated with mental health treatment there. It covered varying dates in 2014, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2020. We received South Carolina Department of Social Services employment records. We also received employment records from Whitefield School District. We received an unsigned letter from Rhonda Niederhauser. And that letter talked about stress-related health and mental health symptoms experienced by Ms. Stauch in December of 2019. We received emails from Ms. Stauch to State Trooper Rusty Sanchez related to some accident follow-up that she references to us in our interviews. We received Humana military records. This only detailed bills associated with general medical and mental health services from 2015 to 2018, but there was no details. It was just billing. We also received a number of documents that were authored by Defense's social worker, Mr. Kyle Varville, that were related to in-person interviews that he conducted with different individuals who were familiar with Ms. Stauch.
Any of those documents that you just read, did they have anything to do with any inpatient psychiatric treatment?
None of them.
You alluded to Dr. Niederhauser's visit in that report. Do you recall in her medical record whether or not she asked the defendant if she had any prior psychiatric treatment or psychiatric inpatient treatment?
If Dr. Niederhauser asked that?
Yes. Is it in her medical record?
I don't remember. That is a question that is typically asked, but there was no indication of inpatient psychiatric hospitalization.
Do I need to show you her medical record, or do you recall it not being in there?
I recall it not being in there because I don't recall it being in there, but I'm also happy to look at it if I'm misremembering something.
No, and I guess that's a good way to put it. Obviously, if it was there, you'd probably do some follow-up to see what that was all about, right?
Yes.
Same thing when she booked in the jail. I think we talked about that yesterday. She denied having any prior psychiatric treatment, either inpatient or outpatient.
Yes, I think the only time she's really mentioned the inpatient psychiatric treatment would have been from that hospital that she wasn't able to tell us what hospital it was in Canada.
Okay. I want to go back to you trying to talk to Maria during this last segment we saw. Did you have an opportunity to look at Dr. Lewis's interview with the defendant, Ms. Stauch, in November of 2022?
Yes.
And did you see times where she was able to at least appear to have Maria come out and talk to her?
Yes.
Did you see any triggers, anything that she had to use to trigger some kind of traumatic event to have Maria come out?
It didn't appear that there was anything associated with a traumatic event during those particular interviews.
In one portion, does she appear to write something on a piece of paper, slide it over to Ms. Stauch, and then Ms. Stauch responds using her right arm, and then goes back and forth, and then she switches to using her left arm?
Yes, I do.
And then Maria somehow appears, and she has a conversation with Maria, and Maria has a Spanish accent. Do you remember that?
I do.
Now, you didn't get an opportunity to go back to talk to Ms. Stauch after that evaluation, I take it?
Correct.
Anything about that interchange impact your opinion as to whether or not Ms. Stauch has dissociative identity disorder?
No.
Why?
In terms of dissociative identity disorder, we've talked about what it is and what the criteria is. And throughout this entire evaluation, we've always had concerns about potential feigning and exaggeration. The reason we have those concerns is because the things that Ms. Stauch talks about are symptoms that pretty much anybody who has watched movies or had some sort of access to television would know that this is what multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder looks like in terms of speaking about amnesias, blackouts, different personalities. We've talked about how the typical presentation for a dissociative identity disorder tends to be more subtle, and at the same time, how someone would have seen something, someone who was close to Ms. Stauch. But there's no corroborating data from collateral interviews or even from the mental health record. Ms. Stauch talks about having this mental illness since she was 16 years old, and it's never repeated anywhere. Essentially, individuals who have genuine dissociative identity disorder do experience significant problems with their functioning. Usually it does rise to the level of needing some sort of psychiatric treatment, probably inpatient hospitalization. Those individuals are disturbed by what they are experiencing. And there's a quality to dissociative identity disorder that is involuntary, and it's not something that can be controlled, which is why it is disturbing to those individuals. They tend to be overwhelmed by the symptoms that they are experiencing. In addition to that, they tend to be ashamed about their experiences. So there's a tendency for them to essentially try to withhold some information, maybe minimize that information. They don't want to readily put it out there for people to know I have dissociative identity disorder. They don't enjoy having this condition. And Ms. Stauch's presentation in our interviews would suggest otherwise. One of the most striking components to me is that she doesn't particularly seem to be disturbed by having all of these personalities ending up in different states or different countries. And that's meaningful to me. So, taken together, the lack of substantiating information outside of Ms. Stauch's self-report is not enough for me to be convinced that she actually has this illness.
And did you consult with Dr. Gray about the reasons why you felt it wasn't there?
Yes,
Does he agree with your conclusions?
he does.
And I'm not going to ask you about that again when we go forward, but did you have enough information to rule it out, to not even consider it as a rule out in your diagnosis?
We felt that we had enough to substantiate that this is not what was going on with Ms. Stauch.
And even though another forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis, wrote a report saying she does have this, she diagnosed Ms. Stauch with that disorder, anything about her report or the interview that you reviewed change your and Dr. Gray's opinion?
No. Again, looking at the timeline of everything, considering the fact that we saw Ms. Stauch in 2020 for the competency evaluations, her presentation then, her presentation when we saw her for the sanity interviews, we noted that this claim of dissociative identity disorder and the symptoms that she was proposing, they change and they seem to increase over the course of the 2 years from the time of the offense to the time that we saw her and even to the time that she was seen by Dr. Lewis.
Okay. I'm not going to show him your clips. We're going to talk about your report, okay? Is your report and the way it's written, is that dictated by Colorado statutes?
Yes.
Could you explain that to the jury?
Sure. The Colorado statute indicates certain information that does need to be included in these types of evaluations. So the evaluation that we submitted is pretty standard, meets those requirements in terms of outlining Ms. Stauch's background, all of the information that we had access to, the information that we attempted to seek but didn't actually get by the time we were able to do the evaluation. And then in terms of the sanity analysis, within our test, within our report, we have the culpable mental states outlined, what they are, what the definitions are. We have the general account of what occurred from the police reports. We have Ms. Stauch's self-report and the analysis of whether she, one, has a mental disease or defect as is defined in Colorado statute. And then we would have gone into the analysis of how does the mental disease or defect impact the behavior at the time of the crime, except Dr. Gray and I determined that she doesn't meet that threshold for a diagnosis that would be considered a mental disease or defect here in Colorado.
And I want to talk about that a little bit later in your testimony. Is part of the insanity evaluation in Colorado also include another competency evaluation as part of that?
Yes, it does.
Please explain that to me.
For these types of evaluations, regardless of whether the individual has already been evaluated for competency, it's important to address the issue of competency at the time that we are doing the sanity evaluation. That step comes first before we get into the defendant speaking about what happened to them at the time of the crime, because we want to make sure, since mental health issues are usually involved in these types of referrals, we want to make sure that the individual is not currently experiencing symptoms of mental illness that would impair their understanding of the evaluation that they're doing, of their defenses, of moving forward with this. So it's an ethical component. It's in the statute as well that it's a part of these types of evaluations. But if we were to find that somebody had a current mental health symptoms that were impairing their understanding of issues associated with court, we would stop the evaluation right there, refer them back to the court saying they were not competent so that they could get some form of treatment before returning to finish the sanity evaluation.
And so obviously in this case, since you went forward with the evaluation, did you and Dr. Gray find her to be competent back in March of 2022 into June of 2022?
Yes.
And is that in your report?
It is.
Is your report 22 pages long?
It is.
Who gets this report?
This report is submitted to the court. I believe we directly submit it to the clerk, who then distributes it to prosecution, defense, and the judge.
So the basis of the report is to go to Your Honor.
Yes.
And then we get copies?
Yes.
And you get a subpoena, right?
Sometimes.
Okay. Who wrote this particular report? You or Dr. Gray, or
Both of us.
did you consult on the entirety of the report?
We did. Essentially, I took the lead on one part and he took the lead on the other part. And then we reviewed each other's parts and added anything additional that needed to be there.
Let's talk about what diagnostic impressions you had with regards to Ms. Stauch as part of your insanity report.
Okay.
What did you find?
Ultimately, we stuck with some of our impressions from when we saw her for competency. So we diagnosed the personality disorder with borderline and narcissistic qualities. We also provided a rule-out diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder versus unspecified anxiety disorder.
And why did you not seek further information with regards to those two disorders?
Regarding those two disorders, essentially, we felt that we had all of the information that could be provided to us at this time. We noted that in her history, there's a lot of mention of generalized anxiety disorder. We wanted to give credence to her self-report of the abuse that she experienced. She did report nightmares, some intrusive thoughts, the idea of flashbacks that could be associated with a post-traumatic stress disorder. There just wasn't sufficient information to reach the threshold to say with confidence she has these diagnoses at this point in time, or rather at the time of the alleged offense.
Okay. Did you look at other dissociative disorders with regards to Ms. Stauch besides dissociative identity disorder?
We considered them.
Were you able to make a diagnosis on any other dissociative disorders?
No, the way that she presented her mental health symptoms, it was pretty clear that she was outlining symptoms associated with dissociative identity disorder. There are other dissociative disorders, but she doesn't quite capture the nature of those specific conditions.
Is there anything else that I'm missing with regards to what you put in your report with regards to that disorder?
Which disorder?
The dissociative disorder. Anyone?
Okay. Yes, we did not diagnose dissociative identity disorder.
Now, I want to turn to the question of legal insanity. I think yesterday we talked about that being a legal term.
Yes.
Is there any relation to the type of disorder that you may diagnose someone with to insanity, the legal definition?
Here in Colorado, it's a mental disease or defect, and the definition associated with that is essentially a mental health issue that impairs somebody's understanding or perception of reality.
Is that kind of the first step in the evaluation, or in Dr. Gray's evaluation with regards to legal insanity, to see whether or not there is, in fact, a mental disease or defect?
Yes.
If you do not find a mental disease or defect, do you stop there?
Essentially, yes. If there's no mental disease or defect, then there can't be anything that impairs their capacity to form intent or their ability to understand right from wrong. Both of those things have to be tied together. So if one condition doesn't exist, then legally there would be nothing impairing the definition associated with the sanity evaluation.
And so, just to make sure I understand you correctly, are you saying that the mental disease or defect has to be the cause or the reason why an individual may not have the capacity to know right from wrong or have the capacity to form the culpable mental state?
Correct.
So if that's not there, there's no reason to look at the other two, correct?
Correct.
I want to do that anyway.
That's fine. That's fine. Yes.
What are some of the things you look at in determining whether or not someone may have the capacity to form the culpable mental state?
For that, we look at what the specific culpable mental states we're talking about, which are included in the definition of the charges. I believe I may have said this the other day, but in these charges, we have the culpable mental state of with intent, knowingly, and recklessly. All of those have specific definitions. With intent, the definition is whether that person has essentially a conscious objective to create or have the actual action associated with the statute occur. So more simply, for that one, that's related to tampering with evidence and moving the body. So is that action done with intent, with a conscious objective in mind? Whenever we're considering that, we're thinking, what does it mean to be conscious? We are looking at somebody's ability to think, reason, form judgments. We also take into account issues associated with emotions as well, to see if there's anything that is making it so that that individual is incapable of forming intent. It's a very high bar to meet. I'm not sure that I've ever seen somebody who a mental illness lacks their capacity to form intent. Certainly, intent can be skewed because of irrational thoughts, things like delusions, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case here. So we also look at the other culpable mental states, which are knowingly, And knowingly is just, do you have an awareness of what is going on? So again, we consider, what does it mean to have an awareness? You have to be awake, conscious, have some sort of understanding of what's going on. Recklessly, the definition is...
And Doctor, I'm going to stop you there because that doesn't apply anymore in this case.
Okay, thank you.
But there is another culpable mental state that I want to talk to you about.
Okay.
It's called after deliberation.
Yes.
Okay. And I'm just going to read you the definition of after deliberation, and then ask you some follow-up questions.
Okay.
The term after deliberation means not only intentionally, but also that the decision to commit the act has been made after the exercise of reflection and judgment concerning the act. An act committed after deliberation is never one which has been committed in a hasty or impulsive manner. Okay? Have you heard that definition before?
Yes.
And I really want to talk about the facts of this case with regards to that culpable mental state. Are you okay with that?
Yes.
When you look at this particular case, do you look at the facts that are presented to you, for instance, things that Ms. Stauch did before the crime?
Yes.
Do you look at her actions during the crime?
Yes.
And do you look at her actions after the crime?
Yes.
And are all those things taken into consideration when you and Dr. Gray are deciding whether or not Ms. Stauch is legally sane or legally insane?
Yes.
Tell me about that. What did you look at in this case with regards to the facts when we talk about after deliberation?
When it comes to the facts, there's a lot of information in the police reports that outline Ms. Stauch's whereabouts. Even afterwards, there's a lot of information that outlines her whereabouts, varying stories that she told to the police as it pertains to what actually happened with Gannon. We take that into account. I feel like when we're conducting a sanity evaluation, we do tend to focus more on what it is that the defendant is telling us in terms of their perception of what happened. Hopefully what they are telling us is somewhat in line with what the facts of the case are. However, even in this particular situation, Ms. Stauch outlined having some, she says, paranoia. I might say it sounds more like a hypervigilance or being on guard that someone is watching her or tracking her associated with this accident that occurred. And the accident did occur, so it's not a delusion. It's a reaction to something that did happen in her life. We are very focused on the time of the actual offense and her perception of what was going on with her, as well as what's going on afterwards. All of those times we are looking at, is there some sort of mental health issue that is impacting her behaviors, her thoughts, her thinking, her emotions at all of those stages? Usually the police reports can't tell us the perspective of the defendant, which is why we rely so much on what it is that the defendant has to say. As I said, we're looking for a mental disease or defect. And if we can identify what that is, we are looking at how does that impact the behaviors, the emotions, the motivations, the intentions that are happening throughout this period of time. In terms of what happens afterwards, there is always the question of how does the person respond to the actual crime? Does the person call the police themselves? Does the person try to hide evidence? Does the person run away? All of that's important when considering whether somebody's insane at the time. And what's even more important is the why, if you can get to that.
Fortunately, in a lot of murder cases, you don't get to that why, right?
Correct.
And that's usually because there's only one person who survived who knows why.
Oftentimes.
Now, we didn't talk about the capacity to know right from wrong, but it sounds like you incorporated that into your answer a little bit. Is that what you were saying?
Perhaps. I know I was saying a number of things. I mean, we're looking at both of those definitions as it pertains to the issue of sanity. And we've gone on about capacity to form the culpable mental state. And the other one is whether or not a mental disease or defect impairs the individual's capability to understand right from wrong.
What about the autopsy report and the nature of Gannon's injuries? Does that help you and Dr. Gray evaluate whether or not she had the capacity to form the intent to kill or the capacity to form after deliberation with regards to
Autopsy reports give us some information in terms of what happened to a victim factually, but it can't tell us exactly what was going on with the person who committed the offense.
What about the capacity to know right from wrong? The fact that Gannon's body was discovered in Florida and the evidence suggests that Ms. Stauch drove his body left. Does that impact any opinion with regards to the capacity to know right from wrong?
Again, I don't know if it's so much those details that weigh in on the analysis of somebody's capability of understanding right from wrong. For us, it's whether or not there's a mental disease or defect that would undermine or impinge on that ability. And Ms. Stauch, even if we were to believe that she had a dissociative identity disorder, she speaks about how after the actual act of shooting Gannon or the person in the cape, how she dissociates and that it is her personalities that are trying to help cover up what it is that occurred. Even so, there is no particular mental illness that is impacting Ms. Stauch's ability to understand what is right and what is wrong. And there's no clear mental illness that would appear to impact any of the personalities that she told us about as it pertains to understanding right from wrong.
Does that also apply to her decision making, her ability to make decisions? Does a mental illness come into play when you're rendering opinions as to legal incident?
Yes.
Same analysis?
Same analysis, that there is no mental disease or defect that impairs her understanding of reality that would make it so that she was incapable of forming judgments or thinking things through. Even in her own words, at least as it pertains to the shooting, Ms. Stauch talks about how she thought that there was an intruder in the home. She reaches for a gun. She hears these words, Ecclesiastes 3:3, time to kill, time to heal. All of that suggests that there is some capacity to form some intent. She's not lacking in that.
I think you answered this question already, but knowing me, I'm going to ask it anyway. The diagnosis of other specified personality disorder with borderline and narcissistic traits, does that raise to the level of a mental disease or defect?
It does not in this case.
Ultimately, what is your final opinion, along with Dr. Gray, with regards to the defendant's sanity at the time that Gannon Stauch was killed?
It was that Ms. Stauch was seen at the time of the crime.
And did Dr. Gray sign the report, this 22-page report that you both authored?
He did.
And obviously you signed it as well?
Yes.
Those are my questions, Your Honor. Thanks.
Cross-examination. Me.
Dr. Torres. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good. I want to kind of first just clear up some procedural history on this case, so I think that everybody has a little bit better understanding of how some of this stuff occurred. You're aware that myself and Mr. Cook are not Ms. Stauch's first set of attorneys.
Correct.
She had a different set of attorneys for a little over a year.
Yes.
And those were the ones who were actually involved with the first competency evaluations.
Yes.
And then at some point in time, Ms. Stauch was pro se.
I feel like I vaguely remember that.
Okay. And are you aware that when somebody is pro se, they would be given all of the discovery and access to the body worn camera and everything else for the period of time that they were representing themselves?
Yes.
And so there wasn't the fact that she had reviewed all the stuff and had access. There's nothing. There's nothing wrong with that.
I agree.
Okay. And then at some point, I think it was May of 2021, myself and Mr. Cook took over the representation of Ms. Stauch.
Yes.
And when the statute, the not guilty by reason of insanity statute in Colorado is kind of designed for a flow of information from you to me and me to you and the district attorney. It's trying to get everybody as much information as possible.
Yes.
And generally, when you guys, if there was something that came up in one of these interviews, sometimes then you would either email me or call me and said, can you get this type of documentation that we're looking for?
Yes.
And there was efforts. I mean, it appeared to you, there was efforts we tried, when you guys asked for stuff, we tried to get it to you.
I agree with that.
Okay. And there was cooperation by the defense and the prosecutions. Everybody cooperated to try to get you guys as much information as possible.
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And just to be clear, you don't judge differently information given by the defense and information by the prosecution. And what I mean by that is you were given reports written by my social worker regarding interviews that were done in South Carolina.
Yes.
You don't necessarily disregard that or give that less weight or reliability or credibility than you would necessarily with police reports.
Correct.
The social worker is a professional person, and a professional person, you would assume, is going to try to give you accurate information.
Yes.
And kind of, on that train of thought, is there concern by forensic evaluators at the state hospital regarding implicit bias?
Could you say more?
Well, and I'm asking this, and I'm doing it, not making any accusations or disparaging or anything. I'm just exploring the implicit bias. You would agree with me that things are difficult at the state hospital right now, as far as staffing, bed space, and so forth.
Okay. Yes, it's having its difficulties.
Okay. The state hospital is actually currently under a contempt order by a federal judge.
Yes.
And that's in regards to competency.
Yes.
And that's in regards to that the state hospital had been taking too long to get competency evaluations done for people that are in custody.
Yes.
And it puts a strain on the state hospital.
I would say yes.
Okay. And there's actually a significant backlog for people who are in custody in jails to get into the competency evaluations completed at the state hospital.
That remains true.
Okay. And if Ms. Stauch was to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, she would more than likely be housed at the state hospital.
Yes.
And if she was housed at the state hospital, she would take up resources at the state hospital.
I can see what you're trying to say. And I would say that that doesn't go into the analysis of a sanity evaluator. And to the best of my understanding, the beds that they have set aside for individuals who are adjudicated not guilty by reason of insanity is separate from those that they have for people who need competency restoration treatment.
No, and I understand that as well. But as far as one of the issues at the state hospital is a lack of staff, is as far as like forensic nurses, other forensic types of staff, that's difficult at the state hospital right now, correct?
They are having that problem, yes.
And wouldn't somebody who, regardless of the bed space, if they were on, you're adding an extra person who has been adjudicated not guilty by reason of insanity, isn't that person going to take some resources away as far as staff?
I could see that, but again, as an evaluator, that's never something that we're considering.
I know, and I understand that. And I understand the professionalism of both you and Dr. Gray. But is there, and I guess that's my question, is there any concern that there could be implicit bias? So a bias that you're maybe not even aware of that could affect an evaluation?
I don't think that there is an implicit bias in the way that you are describing it here. Obviously, biases are a thing, and we do our best to check our biases as often as we can.
Okay. And like I said, I wasn't meaning that in a disrespectful way. I was just asking questions regarding it. So thank you. Let's talk a little bit about, first start with disassociation, and then we'll kind of move on to dissociative identity disorder.
Okay.
Have you ever actually treated anybody who had dissociative identity disorder?
I have never treated anybody with dissociative identity disorder.
Have you ever diagnosed anybody with dissociative identity disorder?
Not yet.
Okay. And so then when you are presented with something that you may not have a ton of personal experience with, what both you and Dr. Gray will do is you'll go to literature to see, what is dissociative identity disorder? How does this look? How does this present? And you will use that in making your evaluation.
Correct.
And that's what you guys did here.
It is.
And you guys were actually kind enough. We had emails exchanged. I gave you guys some articles on dissociative identity disorder, and you guys gave me some articles and everything as well that end up actually a very lengthy book on dissociative identity disorder that you guys, used to make this diagnosis and determination with Ms. Stauch.
Yes.
And so as far as disassociation, it's kind of a tricky term, isn't it? I mean, as far as what exactly it is, there's some differing standards, especially in the book that you guys gave me, as far as what exactly disassociation is and when it occurs and what causes it.
That's one of the issues of the controversy around dissociation and dissociative identity disorders.
Well, and let's talk, historically, it's been somewhat of a controversial diagnosis.
Yes.
It goes, I think initially there's diagnosis of it all the way back, the late 1800s, there was diagnosis of it. It was kind of there and thought of a lot. And then it kind of, as we started learning more about the brain and how the brain chemically works and everything like that, it kind of fell out of favor. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's fair to say.
And then we had, kind of pop back up again in the 80s and the media and the movie Sybil, which everybody watched as a kid, or at least I did. And it was kind of in the forefront nationally, but still there was a lot of controversy regarding it amongst the mental health community.
Yes.
But it would also be fair to say that in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of scientific study and data that has come forth to kind of confirm that disassociation actually occurs and is a real and actual phenomenon.
I think that that's fair to say.
Okay. And while the exact definition of what occurs off, it's more or less, it's an altered state of consciousness.
Dissociation?
Yes.
Yes.
And it can be anything from, I'm like I do almost every night for the last month and a half. When the day is done, I get in my car and I leave my office, and all of a sudden I'm home and I have no memory whatsoever of the drive. That's kind of a disassociation, isn't it?
Yeah, they describe that as a normal
Yeah.
non-pathological type of dissociation that anyone can experience.
And that kind of gets me into the next thing that I wanted to talk about. Disassociation, some of the literature and everything kind of breaks it down between adaptive and maladaptive disassociation.
Okay.
And adaptive disassociation could be when disassociation is positive and it helps a person, in their day-to-day life, and it's useful for them.
I feel less familiar with the research that makes this particular separation, but I am following you.
Okay. Well, I mean, as far as the altered state of consciousness and disassociation, I mean, to some degree, in kind of personas. I mean, and some of it uses personas and disassociation a little interchangeably, but oftentimes people have different personas, and it's adaptive. For example, we talked about this with Dr. Grimmett, when I come into court, I've got a tie. I speak differently than I do with my children. And once I come into the doors and everybody's here, I don't have to think like a lawyer. I take on the persona of a lawyer. And that's a different persona that I have with my children.
Sure. We all tend to behave differently depending upon our context.
Yes. And kind of the theory or the thing with dissociative identity disorder is amplified to a degree that it's become non-adaptive or maladaptive, that the person has different personas within them, but they don't have the authority or ability to control the shifting between the two of them, and they're much more pronounced as far as the differences between the personas.
I think that is a fairly accurate description of one of the criteria of dissociative identity disorder.
Okay. And again, for it to be a disorder, it would indicate that it's impacting my life. And so by just calling it a disorder would indicate that I don't have the ability to control it.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that you're using as far as whether or not somebody has that disorder or not. Being able to control it would be much more like me. I'm a lawyer here, and then when I go play with my kids, then I'm not serious. I laugh. I do stuff
right.
like that.
It becomes a conscious decision, so to speak. And as well as with the idea of it being a disorder, that would suggest that it has to have some sort of impairment in your functioning. So is it impairing your relationships, your ability to work, your ability to have an education, some other part of your life?
And also, a disassociation can affect how memories are stored.
Yes.
And to some degree, would you agree with me that happens, that can be adaptive and that can happen with normal people? For example, a soldier who is in war and has experienced trauma in that. So they have their soldier kind of persona, and then they come home, they're on leave or everything with the family, they'll have a different persona.
Yes.
And they may try to disassociate the memories of those traumas and keep those trauma memories over here while they're at home interacting with their family.
Like just trying not to think about it?
Yes. And trying to keep, and it's easier because that memory, and this is part of the theory of disassociation, because that memory was stored when I was in my soldier persona, it's a little bit easier to keep it over there when I'm in my other persona.
Okay.
Then have you seen some of the literature that reflects that?
Again, I haven't specifically read anything that outlines it in that matter, but I'm following you, and I believe that is something that can happen.
Can happen, and that would be adaptive.
Yes.
And people you're exposed to a lot of secondary trauma in your job.
Yes.
They're exposed to a lot of secondary trauma in their job. I'm exposed to secondary trauma, and keeping that memory at bay when I'm at home with my children may be an adaptive semi-form of disassociation.
I don't know that I would use that term. And at the same time, I think that is something that we all naturally do.
And again, then part of the theory when we go to dissociative identity disorder is those memories are stored with the other persona and they don't necessarily have access to it.
Sometimes, yes.
I mean, and that's kind of the theory, and kind of going into that into how dissociative identity disorder is informed or caused. I mean, the literature is pretty much in agreement. It's almost, as far as dissociative identity disorder, is almost always and exclusively caused by childhood trauma.
There is a very high correlation with that.
And generally, it's not just one instance of childhood trauma. It is complex or long-standing childhood trauma.
I think it either has to be fairly severe, it can be prolonged, and everybody responds differently to the issue of trauma.
Sure. And I guess that's actually a good point. Not everybody who suffers childhood trauma, not everybody who suffers complex childhood trauma develops dissociative identity disorder.
Correct.
And what are the different types of factors that would cause somebody who suffered complex childhood trauma to develop dissociative identity disorder?
Some of the factors are going to be related specifically to that person's personality, how sensitive they are to issues of trauma. Some of them might even be related to the context or environment in which they are raised and whether they have support in place to help them deal with trauma versus not having that.
Especially the lengthy book that you gave me, a lot of it, sometimes it talked about how dissociative identity disorder can be connected or can kind of go through attachment, especially disorganized attachment.
Yes, it is, again, correlated with that type of attachment style.
And just what is disorganized attachment?
Disorganized attachment, like I'm going to take a step back from that question. It's a much lengthier response. There's different attachment styles. All of us have some sort of attachment style. There's healthy attachment styles, and there's less healthy attachment styles. Secure attachment, that is when essentially you've been raised in a family, you've learned to trust your caregivers. I would also go ahead and say that attachment is something that forms when you are very young, probably within that first year or two of life. So there's secure attachment whenever you have learned to trust your caregivers, that they will be there for support. And for the most part, relationally growing up, you don't tend to have too many difficulties as it relates to attaching to a romantic partner. And then there's less healthy forms of attachment. We'll just go straight to disorganized attachment. I think they also call it ambivalent, avoidant attachment. Essentially, whenever somebody is raised in an environment, and again, thinking you're very young when this happens or when this forms, where things are inconsistent, you yourself have some sort of confusion in terms of whether you can trust a caregiver or not. When we're considering issues of abuse when you are very young, it can result in problems in attachment style. This can affect your relationships in the future. Disorganized attachment or ambivalent avoidant, it's when, or is it anxious avoidant? Anyways,
I think it's anxious.
Yeah, thank you. It is anxious avoidant. There is ambivalent attachment, but we won't get into that. Anxious avoidant is when you feel like you need that security, you want it, but you're not sure that it's there. So you might also be semi-avoidant to trust individuals. You see this in the push-pull that you sometimes see in relationships with people who do go on to develop a borderline personality disorder. And even in a dissociative identity disorder, as we've noted, that attachment style can be present.
Okay. And Dr. Schwartz, I'm going to play a short clip from your interview with Ms. Stauch. For the record, this clip is from March 24th, 2022 at time mark 34:20, and it's just right about 3 minutes.
We'll talk a little bit about the abuse that you suffered.
Oh,
Were you ever physically abused? So like, some people might not consider it physical abuse. It depends on your perception of it. But like belts, mop, stick, broomsticks, switches, like wasn't a bad kid at all. I mean, I might pop off with a mouth and have a smart mouth, but I never.
we're having some technical, let's give it a second. If not, then I'll just ask you about it.
The way they upbringing of people, like, you know, the whole spare the rod, spoil the child type thing from scripture is very Bible Belt, Southern Baptist, like that's what the community is. So feeding people with sticks and make you go get your own switches and stuff like that is common, you know what I mean? Now, the part about putting me in the closet all the time, that's like the extreme because that's not part of the spirit of rod for a child having to keep me from finding out what my stepdad was doing. My mom, sorry, was like abuse and stuff. That was going to keep me from, but they knew I was smart enough to figure it out.
You ever see your stepdad? Your mom,
Yeah.
or your other.
So when he got demoted from tax sergeant to staff sergeant, that was when we were living on the base. I call it military police, 911. I got in trouble because he got demoted from tax sergeant to staff sergeant because he hit my mom and she went across the kitchen table and busted her head open and an ambulance had to come to the base. I was always told that that was my fault, that he lost money because he got demoted. We were on base, and they told us, like, my mom would be like, oh, so, like, you know how bases are by range, like, the different houses you can live in. So we had to move into a smaller house because he got demoted, and, like, everything was my fault for calling 911 for it. That was the first time that, like, I like, really remember vividly, like, how the abuse was, and then it only got worse and we went back. There would be consistent fights, consistent blood, consistent sleeping in cars, running from him. His own family would even like when he was like that when he was there. And like my stepsister Amy, we lived like adjacent to the house with her grandma. She wouldn't even stay with us on weekends because she knew how bad it was. Like everyone knew, no one wanted to like. Basically, I used to stay across the street because the community, you know, they didn't want to come over there because he'd get so bad.
And so she's basically describing an incident where her stepdad hit her mother so hard she was knocked unconscious and busted her head open. She called the police. The police came, and then her stepdad, because he was in the military, was demoted, and the family suffered. They had to go to a smaller house and lost income, correct?
Yes.
And that incident was documented both by Aunt Brenda and by her mother actually confirmed that incident took place.
Yeah, I remember her aunt, because we spoke specifically with her aunt, largely corroborated that there was abuse going on in the home.
And that specific instance in the reports done by Mr. Barvel, that was given to, and the mom admitted that occurred.
I don't specifically remember that simply because I don't remember every single detail.
Sure. If I could approach. Okay. I'm approaching you with the report from the social worker that we provided to you.
Thank you. Yes, it does summarize that.
All right, first, you got that. You may go ahead.
And then in other parts of that, interview that you did with Ms. Stauch, she talks about James sexually molesting her, and that she would go to her mother to try to say, you know, he's doing this, intervene, help. And that what she relayed to you is that her mother wouldn't do it because last time we got the police involved, the family suffered financially.
Yes.
And as far as the impact that that would have on a child could be substantial as far as trauma.
I think it counts as trauma. Yes.
And and not only the sexual molestation being the trauma, but then the rejection by the primary caregiver of protecting.
Yes.
And again, just for the record, the book that I keep referring to is Dissociation and the Dissociative Disorders, Past, Present, and Future. It talks about the correlation between children who suffer childhood trauma and the ones that develop dissociative identity disorder. And it talks about one of the issues that there is a significant correlation is betrayal.
I don't remember that specifically.
Okay. And betrayal, it could be, but this is that type of instance that you have a step parent or something who is committing the act, and then the child goes to the caregiver to try to get help, to get safety, to get this to stop, and they refuse to intervene.
I think all of that can be subsumed under emotional trauma.
Emotional trauma. And kind of when we're talking about the phenomena of dissociative identity disorder, this would be the type of thing that could cause it in a child who still, I mean, she's describing the sexual trauma starts 9 and continues on until she leaves home.
Yes.
And so a 9-year-old child still needs their mom. They still even need, the stepdad for food, shelter, and kind of how we went back to attachment. Children need emotional support as well. And so they need that attachment from their caregivers, correct?
Yes.
And the theory behind dissociative identity disorder is, especially when the other primary caregiver is not intervening, the child has to make a split. And the abuse memories, the emotional trauma goes in one personality, and those memories are shielded from the other personality, who can then go to the mom, go to the stepdad for food, shelter, and emotional support.
That is the theory around how dissociative identity disorder can come to be from issues of trauma.
Okay. And both the reports that we gave you and your interview with Aunt Brenda described a very turbulent upbringing.
I agree.
I mean, it seemed James was a very violent and abusive alcoholic.
Yes.
And while there was no direct corroboration of the molestation, would you agree with me that James seemed to engage in conduct that it would at least raise concerns regarding molestation?
Yeah, we're not negating the abuse that Ms. Stauch says that she experienced when she was young.
And there is some comorbidity between pedophiles and substance abuse in the DSM-5.
I'd have to read the DSM-5, and I would say that there's comorbidity with substance use with a lot of disorders.
Sure. And also when you talk about, one of the things when you look for molestation is somebody who crosses boundaries can be a concern.
Crossing boundaries, yes.
Yeah. And there was documentation that Aunt Brenda talked about to us, and I believe with you, of James would often walk around in his underwear with the kids present.
She mentioned that, yes.
And James giving her, after Miss Stauch had moved out, giving her younger siblings alcohol to the point that they passed out.
That detail I don't remember.
Okay. That could be a concern as far as somebody crossing boundaries in regards to molestation.
It's certainly a concern about
Yeah.
parenting behavior.
Sure. It's somebody who has dissociative. Well, let me rephrase this. The theory and the literature seem the theory and the literature supports that dissociative identity disorder is a defense mechanism, is primarily a defense mechanism dealing with substantial childhood trauma.
Yes.
And kind of in that vein, and I think you were, stating this in regards to some of the questions Mr. Young had, because it's kind of a defense mechanism and it's impacting, a child when they were growing up and everything like that. And every child is different and the trauma is different and everything like that. It often presents itself differently in different people.
Yes.
Sometimes it can be very subtle and sometimes it can be more pronounced.
Correct.
And there's lots of theories, but nothing really definitive for an explanation as to what causes severe substantial DID and what causes minor DID, or what causes a child who could suffer this horrible type of trauma and seem to relatively function okay, and another child who could experience this type of trauma and be an absolute mess.
Correct. There's no consensus.
There's no, and that's with a lot of psychiatry. It's not, I don't want to say not an exact science, but there's a lot of nuance to it because it's how different people's brains develop and how they react to different factors.
Correct.
There is some differences amongst how much memory would be shared between different personas.
Yes.
And there are differences between how aware, and for lack of a better word, I'm going to use the term host persona, how much awareness they would have of the other personas. There appear to be differences between different people with DID.
Yes.
And how much memory would be shared between, and again, I'm going to refer to a host persona and memories that were encoded in other personas. How much of that is shared? It appears to vary between individuals who suffer from this disorder.
Yes.
And there's lots of things that we look at in determining if somebody has the DID. And obviously, one of the main things that we would look at initially is, was there childhood trauma? Because it almost seems you don't get DID unless there's childhood trauma. Would you agree with that? That would be one criteria. Okay.
It's not a defined criteria for dissociative identity disorder. However, given that there is such a large correlation between the two, you would expect one to be present for the other to also be present.
And I've seen different literature as far as the occurrence of dissociative identity disorder, anywhere between 1.5% of the population all the way up to possibly even 6% of the population.
I think I've seen similar numbers, and it tends to be based off of different countries.
Sure.
Or potentially even, I want to say, one substance use treatment center where possibly it was more present.
And in fairness, the 6% estimation seems to be more of an outlier.
I think so. More generally, I've seen about 1%, maybe 1 to 2%.
Well, yeah, any 1.5, 2%, that is more consistent in the literature than the 6% outlier.
Correct.
Generally, and I think this is one of the things that you talked about with Ms. Young, and one of the things, here, for the most part, its appearance and presentation is more subtle than we would, appear, that we see in the movies and so forth.
That is the more typical presentation of it.
Oftentimes, people who are eventually end up being diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, oftentimes they will be in mental health treatment for between 6 to 12 years before they are accurately diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder.
I read that.
And oftentimes they'll have a lot of misdiagnoses. I think some of the literature says 3 to 4 incorrect diagnoses before they are correctly diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder.
I certainly think that that can likely happen depending upon how much information is available to whomever is providing the treatment and how consistent the treatment is.
And would you then agree with me that asking people who've only maybe missed out for an hour and had an hour-long interaction or a shorter period of time, if they notice drastic changes in her personality, would not necessarily be that helpful in determining whether or not she legitimately suffered from DID or not?
I think it would be really difficult to diagnose it in about an hour without any other indication that it might be present.
And would you agree it would be kind of misleading to suggest that somebody in an hour-long conversation would notice somebody with DID?
Just off of observations, I think it's unlikely to happen.
Okay. The DSM-5 indicates that one of the conditions that people with DID will initially seek treatment for is obsessive compulsive disorder.
I don't specifically remember reading that in the DSM. It also wouldn't surprise me that people might seek treatment for issues of depression or anxiety.
And the records that we have given you, I mean, they definitely document that since 2016, Ms. Stauch had been seeking treatment for anxiety.
Yes.
And we do have records from 2013. We don't have specifically, but there appears to be billing in those records that she was seeking mental health treatment since 2013, while we don't know exactly what that treatment entailed.
Correct.
One of the things that correlates or is often seen in people with dissociative identity disorder is suicide attempts.
You do see that.
Ms. Stauch talked about being in a turtle suit.
When she was at the jail?
Turtle suits at the jail you're aware of put on people who have attempted suicide.
Yes.
One of the things that you will see in people with dissociative identity disorder oftentimes is a sporadic work history.
Yes, you do see that.
And in some of his interviews that you have reviewed of Mr. Stauch, talked about Mrs. Stauch's sporadic work history.
Yeah, and I would agree that it was spotty. I think she noted to us that her longest period of work was approximately 6 years, maybe when she was in her mid-20s to early 30s, and that she didn't work for a period of time specifically associated with taking care of the children. Other than that, there's a little bit of jumping around from one job to another in the later years.
Some of the literature notes that sexual promiscuity can be present with people with DID, but that they actually don't enjoy it.
I don't remember that specifically.
I submitted an article, Dissociative Identity Disorder, a Controversial Diagnosis, by a Dr. Paulette Gillig. If I could approach with it.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I can give you my another copy of it.
Oh, if you got a copy, that's great.
Yeah.
This one or this one?
Take this one. I got part. Let me approach.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
And so you had a chance to. These are some of the articles that I sent to you, both yourself and Dr. Gray.
This one does not look familiar. And I printed out the 8 articles you sent me and read 6 of the 8.
And with this article, however, does it appear to you to be the type of peer-reviewed journal that would be relied upon people in your profession?
I'm not sure if this is a peer-reviewed journal or more of a newsletter. I'm not 100% familiar with it.
Okay, if you go to page 28 of that article, it has references.
It does have references.
It appears to have over 43 references.
It does.
This article, if you go to page 27 of that article, in regards making the diagnosis a clinical description,
Okay.
if you go about so if you go about halfway down on that, it says patients who have been diagnosed with DID frequently report chronic suicidal feelings and some attempts.
Yes.
And that would be consistent with other literature that you've seen.
Yes.
Sexual promiscuity is frequent, but patients usually report decreased libido and have inability to have orgasm.
It does say that.
We've given you a lot of medical records of Ms. Stauch.
Yes.
Are you aware, do you recall those medical records? She's had multiple treatment for sexually transmitted diseases.
I don't remember that specifically.
Also had both multiple miscarriages and terminated pregnancies.
That I do remember.
Could that be consistent, especially the terminated pregnancies? Could that be consistent with somebody with DID? For example, one persona wanting to get pregnant and have a child and another persona not.
I suppose that could happen. I also don't know that it would be specifically consistent with the diagnosis. It's not outside the realm of possibility.
Okay. One of the things that the literature indicates to look for or can be a sign of DID is depersonalization.
Yes.
And that could be talking about oneself in the third person. Could that be a sign of depersonalization?
Not necessarily in and of itself.
But it could be. I'm not asking for it in itself.
Sure. Okay. Well, depersonalization is more of a subjective feeling of feeling detached from one's body. So I'd say just because somebody speaks about themselves in the third person doesn't necessarily mean they're having that experience of depersonalization.
And would you agree that using different names could be an indication of dissociative identity disorder?
I think that's one of the indicators that one would look for when it comes to the different personality states.
And it's verified from both Al Stauch and Harley Hunt that Ms. Stauch did use the name Taylor.
Yes.
You reviewed the discovery in the case?
Yes.
Do you recall an FBI report regarding somebody who was in training to become a flight attendant at Spirit Airlines?
I remember Ms. Stauch wanting to become a flight attendant. I don't remember this detail where it was coming from or specifically what the FBI report said about it.
I may approach.
You may.
This is an FBI report dealing a conversation with Maria Boyer. Take a look at that. Go grab it. Okay. Sorry. That's okay.
Okay.
In that report indicates the FBI interviewed a woman who was in training at Spirit Airlines,
Yes.
that she had had communication over text and Facebook with Ms. Stauch,
Yes.
but that she knew her as Aubrey.
Yes.
I may approach? You may.
Do you want this back too?
That, while not positive, could be consistent with somebody who suffers from DID.
The only question I would have about it are the details that Ms. Stauch provided to that woman that are consistent with things that Ms. Stauch told us that are in line with her history as she is related.
Part of the thing, when the report by Dr. Lewis was provided to the district attorney, there were some underlying data that was, or underlying things that she based that on that was provided as well. Was that shared with you?
The underlying data that Dr. Lewis
Yeah.
relied upon?
Not data, but as far as collateral information.
I can't remember specifically what it noted.
Okay, specifically, there was a packet of signatures by Ms. Stauch that predated the offense. Do you recall reviewing those?
I did not review them.
Would somebody having different signatures as far as how that signature is presented that predates the offense, could that be evidence of DID?
Possibly.
Okay. I'm going to ask, what is the difference between structural disassociation and alterations in consciousness?
Structural disassociation and alterations in consciousness?
Yes.
I feel like I would need to understand a bit more about what you were asking me to define.
Well, in the dissociation past, present, and future, it talks about in a clinical setting how it can be difficult for a clinician to distinguish between structural disassociation and alterations in consciousness. And at least my reading of it seemed to be structural disassociation would be kind of more what we were talking about originally as far as adaptive disassociation, where a person may go to a different place or be different, maybe not paying attention to what the person is saying. And then alterations in consciousness being more consistent with DID as far as the changing in personas.
Okay. I'm glad you said that. I would have flipped those. And
Okay.
at the same time, to speak to the issue that I think that you are raising, there, in terms of it being subtle and not being able to readily observe it, a person can switch from one personality to another, but not necessarily show any behavior demonstrating that. It is something that happens internally, which is why a lot of the research and even the DSM says that typically dissociative identity disorder presents as multiple states kind of being present at the same time, and why it's subtle and one wouldn't necessarily notice it.
And I think sometimes it even talks about it's not necessarily, and again, the Sybil, where I'm a young kid and I'm an astronaut, but the personas will kind of shift as to which persona may be better functioning in a certain type of situation.
Yeah, that I'm not so sure. I understand it more as something that happens involuntarily that can't be controlled, as opposed to adapting to the environment.
But could it involuntarily shift subconsciously to a persona who would be better able to handle a situation?
The shifts can happen in response to some sort of trigger,
Okay.
and they can also happen randomly, to my understanding.
And when we're talking about triggers, one of the things that can be perplexing or difficult or cause the confusion to somebody with DID is they could be triggered by something that relates to a memory that is shelved in another persona, and so they don't even understanding why something is triggering them. Why the host may not understand why something triggers them.
Well, there would be that amnesia, so the host wouldn't have the realization necessarily that it is happening. And that's where the confusion and the distress that comes from having dissociative identity disorder can come into play.
Because a lot of times trauma and the trigger is that's stored in the body.
Yeah, there's literature that says that.
Yeah. And so the body can be reacting to trauma, but the host personality fails to connect why this is triggering or why this is causing this kind of trauma response. And that can be one of the things that can be very confusing to somebody who suffers from DID.
The whole thing can be confusing,
Sure.
especially because there's some component of amnesia associated with it. And then at the same time, the literature talks about how there's some awareness, sometimes even among the personalities, that it's a bit more porous, even though you would expect to see amnesia.
Well, and sometimes literature reflects clusters of personality may share certain memories.
Yes.
And when you were talking about whether or not somebody else, a family member or something, would have noticed these types of things, are you aware that Miss Stauch left the home when her brother Dakota was only 2?
If she told us that, I don't remember that specifically.
Okay. But if they weren't necessarily raised in the same household or had a lot of contact with each other, that may be a possible reason why he didn't notice any of these issues.
I think that's possible. I don't remember off the top of my head how much interaction they've had
Absolutely.
from her ages of adolescence forward.
But whether or not somebody would pick up on the subtle cues of somebody who legitimately suffers from DID would largely be based upon the amount of time that they interact with somebody.
That can certainly be helpful, consistency and amount of time interacting together.
And when Ms. Stauch was speaking, with you about her relationship with Al Stauch, the history that she presented is they actually, even though they had been married for, I think, 4 or 5 years at the point in time of the event, they actually hadn't really lived together for very long.
That's correct.
And so the sustained long interactions between the two of them may not have been as substantial as you would normally expect in a married couple who had been living together for 5 years straight.
That was my impression.
And Mr. Stauch, in the interviews that he did talk some about her varying moods. As far as like 1 week she would be a great mother, and the next week she may act like she doesn't pay attention to the kids at all.
Yes.
And again, he talked about her sporadic work, and that was a thing of frustration for him.
Yes.
In regards to Harley, we provided you with a memorandum regarding our interview with her in South Carolina.
Yes.
Do you recall that memorandum reflecting Harley being somewhat confused by Miss Stauch changing her name to Taylor?
I remember, and I don't know if it's written in that report specifically, I remember her noting that she added Taylor as her middle name and used it with individuals outside the family.
Let me approach.
Yes.
Okay. Second, review that, see if that refreshes your record.
Thank you.
It's on the second page, I think the last paragraph off the top of my head.
Okay.
That memorandum expresses that Harley Hunt had either frustration or confusion regarding the name change to Taylor, that she didn't even know what name to call her mom.
Yes.
It also indicates that her mom was oftentimes up and down.
Yes.
There was a lot of travel, that she almost felt like she was living out of a suitcase.
Yes.
And she talks about how oftentimes she would find her mom crying in a closet.
Yes.
And that would be consistent with what she kind of described to you, that oftentimes she would sleep in the closet.
Yes.
And would you agree that it's not unusual for children who are raised by parents who suffer any type of mental illness to not necessarily be aware of the unusualness until they have left home for a while and look back and say, now that I see other stuff, now I realize how messed up it was, because the kid only knows what they're exposed to.
Exactly. It becomes normalized for them.
I want to talk a little bit about the evaluation that you did, the sanity evaluation that you did. And I guess initially the main thing that I want to get out of the way is feigning or malingering is not exclusive of an actual mental health issue.
Correct.
Oftentimes in a forensic setting, you can have somebody who has a legitimate mental health issue, and for whatever reasons, they may either be making up something else or exaggerating the symptoms of the mental illness that they actually have.
Yes.
And that makes your job much more difficult.
It does.
Because so much of what you do in making these evaluations, having an unreliable narrator makes it difficult.
Yes.
And knowing that, that's part of the reason sometimes you guys give certain tests.
Yes.
One of the tests that you guys gave here is the MMPI-2.
Correct.
And what is that?
That is the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, second edition. And what it is, it's a long test with a number of items. It's used to help with clinical diagnosis because it asks about a number of different symptoms seen in disorders such as anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, antisocial behavior, and other things.
And it's more helpful in a clinical setting because the belief is that somebody who is coming in for treatment is going to try to answer it as honestly as they can so they can get the treatment for whatever is causing them problems.
Yeah, we administer it frequently enough in these types of evaluations because it can be helpful with clinical diagnosis, especially if we get a valid protocol. It's also helpful because it has those validity scales on it. So it can let us know if the person who's sitting in front of us is currently potentially exaggerating symptoms.
But it's not a test that is specifically designed to detect malingering.
There is no test specifically designed to detect malingering. All of the tests that we have can detect exaggeration or feigning.
Okay.
I say they don't specifically address the issue of malingering because there is no test that gets to the motivation that would be important to the issue of malingering.
There are, and I'm going to get to this, and specifically in interpreting the MMPI-2, you guys relied upon an article. I think the primary person on it was a Dr. Brand.
Yes.
You're aware that Dr. Brand has other articles dealing with detecting feigning or exaggeration in people with DID.
Yes.
There are some structured interviews that they indicate can be helpful in making a determination of the validity of DID.
Yes.
You guys did not use any of those structured interview techniques talked about in those in that article.
We used the multidimensional inventory for dissociation, which is another self-report that looks at, again, the gamut of the different dissociative symptoms And it can be particularly helpful for teasing out whether somebody's experiencing a dissociative identity disorder or a post-traumatic stress disorder or borderline personality disorder, which is why we chose that test specifically.
Okay. But you didn't, as far as the structured interviews that Dr. Brand talks about can be of assistance and a DID determination, you guys did not use that specific structured interview.
Yeah, there are a couple, and we did not use them specifically because we were already conducting our own semi-structured interview of sanity, which does include a mental status exam, which goes into a number of the symptoms that one might exhibit for different disorders. And we had asked questions as it pertains to the issue of dissociative identity disorder. And those structured interviews, they simply go off of the criteria as it's outlined in the DSM, and they don't have validity measures. So we didn't see the utility in adding that to our interview.
Okay. And in the back to the article by Dr. Brand, dealing with the MMPI-2, I mean, and not only Dr. Brand, but there's other literature that indicates people with dissociative identity disorder can score higher on the MMP-2.
Yes.
And they can legitimately give answers that would lead for other types of diagnosis would be indicative of an invalid response.
Yeah, the limitation with the MMPI-2, especially in these types of circumstances, is that there's a lot of items on this test, and there's a lot of item overlap on the scales themselves. And on some of the scales that detect the issue of exaggeration, it incorporates items that speak to issues of trauma. So when you have somebody who has a significant trauma history or even a dissociative identity disorder, it is said that they can elevate those scales and still be responding genuinely. And the MMPI has a third scale that looks at the issue of exaggeration that takes some of the trauma stuff out of it and just looks primarily at issues of what you would see in psychiatrically hospitalized inpatients. And she still elevated that one as well, which is you could say, prototypic profile of an individual who might be exaggerating issues of dissociative identity disorder.
And just for the exact quote by Dr. Brand at the beginning, or I think it's like the third paragraph, and I think it's a she, so I'm going to go. It's Bethany Brand, so I'm going to make the assumption here. She indicates the ability to classify individuals with severe trauma and DID correctly is challenging, as individuals with trauma-related disorders, characteristically, it's been a long day.
Characteristically.
Thank you very much. Display high scores on a clinical and validity scales, including on the MMPI-2. These traumatized patients may be misclassified as malingerers or psychotic because of the elevated scores on multiple scales.
Yes.
And basically what they do is they do a study to try to figure out what questions on the MMP-2 would be indicated of actual patients who have been diagnosed with DID versus people who are attempting to malinger or feign DID.
Yeah, they compare them to people who have been coached by somebody in terms of what does dissociative identity disorder look like, as well as those who have not been coached. So they would just be going off of what they believe they know about dissociative identity disorder.
Sybil. Awesome.
Potentially.
Okay. And basically what they did is, so they had 3 groups of people, people with DID, people who've been coached in DID, and non-coached. They gave them all the MMP-2, and then they compared scores. And what they found was certain scores seemed to indicate were endorsed more by the coached or the non-DID people than people with actual DID.
Yes.
And you guys use that in kind of making your determination that her scores did not fit with somebody who has DID.
Yes.
Do you have the raw data with you?
I should have the raw data with me. From which administration?
Let's go with the first one.
I'm ready.
And so it kind of, and taking that and then comparing it, and do you have the article by Dr. Brand?
I do.
All right. Basically what Dr. Brand, and there's actually Dr. Brand and like 7 or 8 other people that helped with this article, they had some different scales, and they had basically DID endorsement direction. They had kind of most and then kind of least in comparison of the 2 groups, or the comparison of the 3 groups. Correct?
Yes.
And then they kind of went to specific questions and had kind of percentages of the, how much of the DID group endorses versus the coach group and versus the uncoached group.
Correct.
One of the questions, there's question number 12, which dealt with sexual difficulty. The DID endorsement group was at 90%. So 90% of people with actual DID in response to that question, when dealt with sexual difficulty, 90% indicated that they had that. It's a true-false question, right?
Yes.
And 76% of the coach group indicated they had that, but only 59% of the uncoached group listed that as a symptom.
Correct.
She actually listed that she had that as a symptom.
Correct.
And so at least with that, in that question, she would be consistent with an actual DID group.
Well, I would argue that I don't know that that is the best item specifically to differentiate, given that 90% is a substantial majority, but I would also consider 76% a majority.
Okay.
And 59% is more than half.
Well, in regards to question 66, which deals with lack of regard for law enforcement, only 1.9% of the DID group endorsed that. That's compared with almost 29% of the coached and almost 50% of the uncoached group.
Yes.
And she said that she would be consistent in her response with the actual DID group.
Yes.
Again, question 123, rejection of law enforcement laws. DID group that had it, 3.8. Coached 16, uncoached 53.7. She denied having that. So she would be consistent in that question with the DID group.
As well as the coached.
Yes. Would it surprise you on, well, I'm not going to go through every one.
Okay.
Would it surprise you that she, on the questions that they list as kind of the flags, that 58% of the time she is consistent with the DID group?
And I would say almost the same with all of the others. It's a little bit all over the place.
Yeah. Okay. In your report, when you're talking about how kind of her speech and so forth, at one point you indicate she displayed a tendency to provide unnecessary and unsolicited detail, a shift to unrelated topics, not responding to questions, and requiring redirection.
Yes.
Could that be consistent with loose association?
I wouldn't call it a loose association necessarily. It's that rambling behavior that maybe we saw in watching some of the interviews. Sorry.
In the rambling behavior, and I understand you're not calling it loose association, it appears, at least in the videos that we watched yesterday, would you agree, the topic that she's talking about somewhat seems to correlate it with it. And what I mean by that, of all the videos that we watched yesterday, when that one where she's talking about the abuse, suffered in James, that to me seemed pretty rambling and almost a loose association.
I'd have to go back and look at that specifically. I would say that generally speaking, she had a tendency to ramble. She would usually come back to the main point or the topic, but sometimes she did need to be asked the question again, simply because she had strayed.
Okay. And so you ended up diagnosing her with a personality disorder, and borderline with narcissistic features. Would that be?
Yes.
What are the similarities between dissociative identity disorder and borderline personality disorder?
There is some overlap, although I'd say that the nature of the symptoms tend to be different.
Okay.
But they both have that identity disturbance. They both have issues with mood swings. They're both correlated, even though it's not a specific criteria for DID, with suicidal behavior and attempts, as well as impairment in functioning.
And in fact, there was some literature, I think like almost 20 years ago, but trying to say that there's no such thing as dissociative identity disorder, and it's just a presentation of borderline personality disorder. Are you aware of it?
If that's the article from 1988 that you provided.
There was a different one. It was another one by Dr. Brand, who seems to do a lot in this. It was a separating fact from fiction, an empirical examination of the 6 myths about dissociative identity disorder.
Yes, I did read that one.
And the one that she disproves is the myth that DID is the same entity as a borderline personality disorder.
Yeah, I would agree that they are two distinct things and they can coexist with one another.
Okay. And so they could be comorbid.
Yes.
And what does comorbid mean?
Comorbid means you have both of them at the same time.
And borderline personality disorder has a correlation with childhood trauma.
Yes.
While it's not like the same as DID is almost all 100%, anywhere between 95 and 100% associated with childhood trauma. Just to be fair, borderline doesn't have that strong a correlation, but there's definitely a correlation.
There's definitely a correlation. I don't know what the percentages might be, but since it's a maladaptive personality characteristics type of disorder that develops in late adolescence into adulthood, it's usually stemming from some of those problematic issues that you see in abuse or neglect or disruptive homes.
And similar to DID, it also has a correlation with disorganized attachment style.
It does.
And it kind of goes on, one of the main features of borderline personality disorder is a almost irrational attachment to a romantic partner.
For borderline personality?
Borderline, yes.
With borderline personality disorder, as it pertains to the issues of romantic attachments or even familial attachments, people that you're close to, you see a pattern of idealizing them and devaluing them, and it can change very rapidly. So that's where that push-pull comes into effect.
And borderline personality, where does that term come from?
It's from a while ago. I do know that borderline personality disorder originated in issues associated with neurosis and psychosis way back in the day, before it became officially a personality disorder.
And the thought was it was on the border between neurosis and psychosis.
Yes.
Because oftentimes people with borderline personality disorder can suffer from psychosis.
Yes, they do have the psychosis.
Okay.
The DSM says transient psychosis. The research says it's not always transient.
Okay. And what the DSM talks about, I mean, so people with borderline personality disorder, especially in times of high stress, can suffer from video and audio hallucinations.
Visual. You said video and audio, but
Thank you.
visual and auditory hallucinations.
And sometimes from delusions.
You see paranoia more so than anything else. I would say that it doesn't always rise to the level of a delusion, because to be a delusion, it has to not be based in anything that's reality. I think that they are quick to be suspicious about other individuals, which is where the paranoia can come in. And it can rise to that level of delusion. It just depends on the person and the severity of the presentation.
And so I guess you have some different, so is there more literature coming out now that psychosis would be longer present as opposed to transitory?
In borderline personality disorder, it tends to be transient, meaning temporary. It comes and it goes. The difference between delusions, as you might see them in a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, is that the individual with a borderline personality disorder and that paranoia that can even enter the realm of delusion is that they tend to maintain more awareness and insight, and they're able to test whether something is based in reality or not. So they still stay within this realm of reality compared to a psychotic disorder that tends to not do that, and they tend to believe the things that they are hearing, whether it's an auditory hallucination or even the delusions that start to develop in their minds.
And would you agree that the characteristics of borderline disorder can kind of foster somebody who will make falsifications or distort the truth or lie or almost pathological lying?
That can happen.
And part of that reason is because people who suffer from borderline personality disorder, they lack kind of a consistent identity of self.
They do have trouble with their own identity. That's one of the criteria.
They kind of have contradictory towards views of themselves. Sometimes they think they're wonderful. Sometimes they think they're the worst thing in the
Yes.
world. They can be prone to loose and unstructured situations, and sometimes they can have a transient loss of reality.
That's what I'm referencing. Yeah.
And they're also, one of the things with borderline personality disorder, they can also be very impulsive.
Yes.
And so all of those features can lead to somebody who may almost pathologically lie.
Potentially.
Something that we may have.
It's going to depend on a case by case type of thing. You don't see pathological lying in all cases of borderline personality disorder, but
It can be seen in people with borderline personality disorder.
yes.
And again, not in all cases, but the underlying cause of both DID and borderline personality disorder can be similar as far as like the childhood trauma and disruptive household.
Yes.
And just to be clear, there is nothing in the Colorado statutes or in any case law that precludes borderline personality disorder from being a significant mental illness that could in some cases rise to the level of insanity.
Yeah, I don't know any case law associated with that. And the statute explicitly doesn't speak to what disorders can or cannot rise to the level of a mental disease or defect.
Well, it kind of excludes antisocial personality disorder.
Thank you. It excludes antisocial personality disorder and issues associated with substance use.
Okay. But any other type of mental illness, depending upon the circumstances, is not necessarily excluded by the statute.
Correct.
And the DSM-5 doesn't make any distinguishing between the level of severity. The DSM-5 itself doesn't make any differentiating between the level of mental illness between a personality disorder and even schizophrenia.
There's no severity level specifically associated with the DSM criteria
Okay, the DSM itself doesn't say this is a serious mental issue and this is just nothing.
because that's going to depend upon how much it's impacting the individual.
And that's kind of what we look at, is to see, we judge it by how much it impacts that individual's life.
And that's part of the analysis of a sanity evaluation.
And you talked about generally with somebody who is going to rise to the level of insanity, we would have to have, generally, I mean, especially when we're talking about, I can't distinguish right from wrong, you're generally talking about psychosis.
Generally speaking, given that the definition of mental disease or defect is a mental illness that impairs perception and understanding of reality, psychosis tends to be the one that we see most frequently.
And conceding that Ms. Stauch is not the most reliable narrator, especially in the second interview that we watched, she does relate symptoms that could be consistent with psychosis.
She says that she experiences them, yes.
Yes. And finally, lastly, in the definition of insanity in Colorado, is whether or not you know right from wrong, not whether or not you know something is a crime.
Correct, it's different.
And somebody can know something, think what they're doing is right, but still know that it's a crime.
Yes.
And I think that's what you were kind of alluding to. You could be insane by definition, think I am killing somebody because I think they're the Antichrist and going to bring the end of the world, but still try to hide that so that I don't go to jail for something that I think is good because of my mental illness, but know that I could suffer consequences for that.
It comes up.
And so it would not be the fact that I am trying to avoid punishment because of it's criminal. That in and of itself, while it could be a factor that you're looking at, doesn't necessarily exclude insanity.
I would say it's one of the data points that we consider looking at a variety of data points when coming to a determination.
Absolutely. But again, kind of Mr. Young was kind of indicating on his, direct view, I can't remember if you or Dr. Grimmett, that, and this happens, sometimes you will have people who, I've had clients who are insane, who are paranoid schizophrenics, who have gone off their medication and they may brutally kill their own children. And then they'll just be sitting there in the blood waiting for the police to come. That happens.
Yes.
And that makes it pretty easy.
It does.
I mean, it's, they're talking about I had to get the devil out of her and she's sitting there and that's an easy determination. But you can have people that could be suffering from a psychosis that they think that they have to do this, but still try to cover up the crime. And that person could, not necessarily always, could still meet the legal definition of insanity.
It would depend upon the circumstances.
Absolutely.
And it's not outside the realm of possibility.
Okay. And it's not excluded by the statute.
It's not excluded by the statute.
We have just a moment. Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Torres.
Thank you.
Redirect Mr. Young.
Yes, thanks, Judge.
Let me clear out of here.
Anything's possible, right?
Many times.
I could go through the DSM-5 and read you all kinds of criteria and say, hey, this is possible, correct?
I would say it depends.
You probably hate when lawyers do that. I didn't get one depends with him. I'm going to read something from the DSM-5 and then ask you some questions, okay?
Okay.
It says, because deceit and manipulation are central features of antisocial personality disorder, it may be especially helpful to integrate information acquired from systematic clinical assessment with information collected from collateral sources.
Yes.
That comes right out of antisocial personality disorder diagnosis, right?
Yes.
And so deceitfulness and manipulation may apply to many mental illnesses.
I'd say yes. And at the same time, with these types of evaluations, the issue of not being completely forthcoming or truthful is something that we're always taking into consideration.
Especially in a criminal case where you're doing a forensic evaluation.
Yes.
In the DSM-5, we talked about the cautionary statement, maybe not with you, but other witnesses, you're familiar with that?
I am.
Caution should be used when using this manual in forensic settings.
Yes.
Did you consider antisocial personality disorder in this evaluation?
We didn't see sufficient information to diagnose an antisocial personality disorder here.
And is that because you didn't have enough information since the age of 15, which is kind of the first step in that?
Well, you are looking at lifetime functioning for many of the personality disorders. But when it comes to antisocial personality disorder, there was just not very much there from what we had access to.
Let me go through 3 criteria because it says you need 3 criteria to evaluate if you have information from the age of 15.
Okay.
Criteria 2, deceitfulness as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. Consistent irresponsibility as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. Lack of remorse as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another. Do you think those 3 criteria apply to Ms. Stauch's case?
I think it's possible. I also think some of the other things that we see in the personality disorders that we noted could account for a little bit of that.
And so antisocial personality disorder is not a mental illness, correct?
It's in the DSM, and it can certainly cause impairment in functioning. And when it comes to legal issues, antisocial personality disorder is excluded because it's associated with criminal behavior.
And that's right in the definition of insanity, is it not?
Yes.
When you state in your report that there is no credible evidence to conclude she has a condition that conforms to the definition of mental disease or defect, what did you and Dr. Gray mean by that?
We mean that we diagnosed the specified personality disorder with borderline and narcissistic traits, and we ruled out the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder and an unspecified anxiety disorder. But essentially what we're saying is that in none of these disorders do we see Ms. Stauch presenting with symptoms that would impair her perception or understanding of reality.
Are you giving your opinions because the hospital has overcrowding issues?
No.
What would happen to your license if you came in here and did something like that?
It would not be good.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to do the job you're doing right now, right?
Correct.
DID is a rare diagnosis.
Yes.
And in the DSM-5, it talks about a study that they did with a group of classified people.
Yes.
What classified people are we talking about?
I don't have access to that study, but it does mention something about substance use. So I wondered if it wasn't conducted in a substance use facility or potentially in some sort of inpatient setting.
And they list out the percentage of people in that group that had DID as 1.4 or 1.4%.
Correct.
out of that small group
Yes.
who has mental illness issues.
Yes.
So that's not related to all society. Although I think, well, I'm not going to ask you that. Go ahead. You know what I'm saying? I think anybody who goes to see a psychotherapist is probably going to be diagnosed with something. It's like when you go get your car changed, you need tires.
I would hope not.
At least you didn't say it depends. We don't know who's in that group, but needless to say, it's a rare diagnosis.
Yes.
Are there any studies that indicate how often that diagnosis is fake in a criminal setting?
I wouldn't have percentages associated with that, and I'm not sure that I've read that anywhere. When it comes to dissociative identity disorder specifically, it is cautioned when it is used in a criminal setting because of the gain that a person might receive by saying that, essentially, that it wasn't them, that it was a different personality.
It's kind of like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right?
Correct.
I have another personality who happens to be a psychopath or antisocial personality disorder that I can't control.
Correct.
Pretty easy thing to just say, right?
Sure.
I just said it.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the childhood trauma that's associated with Miss Stauch. She told you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to say she was 10 to 12 when this happened.
I think once she told us she was 9 and once she told us she was 12. So we stuck with somewhere between 9 to 12.
Okay. Now, is this something that's suppressed for over 20 years and just coincidentally comes out during the death of her stepson?
It's hard to believe.
Why is that?
As we've mentioned or talked before, essentially, you would have expected to see it at some other point manifesting itself, especially if she herself is saying that she's had these different personalities, including the personality of Maria since she was 16 years old.
And we talked about this again, but family members, when we talk about, as Mr. Cellini said it, sometimes it takes 6 to, I believe he said 12 years for it to be diagnosed, is because family members may not know what's going on because there's blackout periods and they can't explain it, things like that.
Potentially.
Is it rare that the individual themselves would know what's going on with it, or would they have to seek help and get into therapy for 6 to 12 years until they figure that out?
That's another, it's going to be, it depends on the presentation and what it is that they are going through. If it is so severe that they are blacking out, finding themselves in different locations, cities, acquiring objects that they have no memory of acquiring, you would think that they would say something to someone.
And the first time that you or Dr. Gray ever learned anything about the potential of Ms. Stauch having dissociative identity disorder is based on a psychological test that you did during the competency evaluation. Is that right?
Well, during the competency evaluation, we weren't looking for dissociative identity disorder. It was never brought up. She did not mention it. Her attorneys did not mention it.
Well, let me. I could be wrong, but I thought yesterday you said there was a test that you asked her about because she answered it a certain way. Am I?
Yes. No, that is correct. Because we gave, during the competency evaluation, 2 psychological tests. One was the Personality Assessment Inventory, the PAI, is the first one that we gave, and she invalidated it. Given that we saw her the following day to finish up our interview, we asked her specifically about some of the items on that test that caused the invalidation, just to see if we could get a better understanding of what happened here. Why was this test invalidated? And one of those questions happened to be an item that asked about whether or not she felt like she had 3 or 4 personalities inside of her. And she had said true. So we simply read the item to her. We ask her, what were you thinking? What does this mean to you when you say true? And even when we asked her about that, she did not talk about having different personality states. She did not name any of these other personalities. Her response to us was essentially talking about different mood states, saying, well, sometimes I feel very competitive when I'm playing sports. Sometimes I feel more compassionate, or sometimes I feel like I lack empathy with my family.
And then was it during the second competency evaluation where Dr. Grimmett actually looked into the DID diagnosis and said it doesn't apply here? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And that was well after she had been in the jail for months.
Yeah, I forget exactly how far after our evaluation Dr. Grimmett conducted hers.
And Dr. Christine Moore, who is a psychologist at the jail, who was meeting with Ms. Stauch almost on a weekly basis, would she be in a good position, based on her weekly conversations with Ms. Stauch, to make a decision as to whether or not she had dissociative identity disorder?
Potentially, and it might depend upon what Ms. Stauch told her. As I imagine, I bet Dr. Moore could tell you better than me, but I imagine that those meetings could potentially be pretty brief.
Do you recall reviewing her notes where she indicated there's no symptoms of dissociative identity disorder based on what Ms. Stauch was telling her?
I remember those notes suggesting that situational anxiety associated with her case was the predominant thread of a diagnosis that they saw during her jail time.
Have a moment, Your Honor.
You may.
Those are my questions. Thanks.
Do any of the jurors have any questions for Dr. Torres? Looks like we have a couple. Mr. Young, if you would retrieve those in council approach, please. Good to go. Dr. Torres, would a person with multiple personalities refer to themselves as I when describing the actions that a different personality carried out?
I don't think so.
And let me know if you need the exhibit for this. And I'm sorry, it's late Friday, and I'm not even sure if you were the witness that had this exhibit, but that's where we're going to start. We were shown how the defendant performed the clock test well on the first competency test. We were told she performed the same test poorly on the second competency test. And I think you were asked the question about, were you aware of the test that was done by Dr. Lewis? Is that right?
Yes, we gave the clock drawing. Oh, is there more?
Yes, there is. I just wanted to make sure that we were thinking about the same thing.
Yes.
Why would the same test be used twice when the first one could train the defendant how to perform or not perform on the second?
Okay. I'm just going to say a little bit to clarify the situation, but during our initial competency evaluation, we gave a brief cognitive screener to see if there were any cognitive problems on it, which is where that clock drawing came in. And she did it fine with us. I don't think the issue of the clock drawing comes up again until Dr. Lewis's evaluations, meaning I don't recall that Dr. Grimmett gave that specific test or knowing any results associated with the clock drawing test there. And in Dr. Lewis's administration of that specific test, the clock came out very different and looks impaired. In terms of why would the same test be given, at this point in time, we would have given that test sometime in 2020. So ostensibly, Dr. Lewis would have given it at some time in 2022. And I think I noted that we gave a cognitive screener, but that test specifically is supposed to be sensitive to issues of brain impairment or some sort of brain dysfunction. If something had happened in between 2020 and 22, like a substantial head injury, it could impact the the results on that particular test. But to answer the question more specifically, why would we give the same sort of test at 2 different times? Depending on the test, sometimes the person might respond differently. So for example, we talked about the MMPIs being administered multiple times, 3 times in this case across the years. That test is more sensitive to what is going on with the person right now. So you could give it last year and you could give it this year and get different results depending upon what's happening with the person if they're receiving treatment. With cognitive tests, those tend to be more stable across time in terms of any issues associated with deficits. But like I said, if something is happening or if something has happened, it can change the results on the test from one administration to the next. And we even see it with issues of severe psychosis. Somebody who's acutely mentally ill with severe psychosis might perform cognitively worse, get treatment, and then perform cognitively better. So there is benefit to giving it at different times.
All right. And then I'm going to rephrase this question a little bit. But let's assume that you believe everything that the defendant has told you and everything that she said in her story. So you're not looking at, I guess, correlating information or anything like that. The question is, if you believe everything the defendant said in her story, would you diagnose the defendant with dissociative identity disorder?
Just basing it off of her self-report?
That seems to be the question, yes.
I think I still would not, because the way that she describes creating the personalities, being able to have some sort of control switching between worlds, to me, that is inconsistent with the nature of a dissociative identity disorder being something that is involuntary, overwhelming, and uncontrollable.
I will allow reasonable follow-up to those questions only. Prosecution?
Just briefly, Your Honor. You don't know why Dr. Lewis administered that cognitive thinking test.
I don't know why.
Consult with her prior to her doing that?
No.
Did you ever consult with her?
We never spoke with her specifically. We just read her report and saw some of the testing and watched the videos.
Judge.
Defense?
Whether or not somebody with dissociative identity disorder could refer to themselves as I when relaying information that another personality did, wouldn't that be somewhat conditioned on that individual and how that disease is presenting themselves in that person?
I suppose it's possible, but whenever I hear somebody say I assume they are talking about themselves.
And then lastly, the question, if you took as face value everything that she said, I understand some of the stuff would be inconsistent with DID and not having control, but at least in relationship to how she described Maria, the Maria personality, that would be more consistent with somebody who had DID, in that she said she did not have control of Maria or access to Maria's memories.
I would be looking at the whole presentation as opposed to just a part of it.
Okay, thank you.